Independence found a small, highly westernized, English-speaking, educated, often Christian elite in positions of power, wealth, and prestige in a nation whose majority was Buddhist and Sinhala-speaking, while its principal minority was Hindu and spoke Tamil. Militant nationalism rebelled against this condition, demanding new leaders and a new emphasis on the indigenous culture, religion, and languages. Rising numbers of educated but non-English-speaking Sinhalese spearheaded this reaction against Western culture, language, and religion. Buddhist extremists resented the large role of Christian missionary schools in the education of Ceylonese, and the large government grants which such schools received. There was also a demand that the affairs of the Ceylonese government no longer be conducted in English, but in the Ceylonese people's own language, which would make a profound difference in access to coveted government careers. Seizing the leadership of this upsurge of nationalistic and religious militancy was S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike, an Oxford-educated Christian Sinhalese aristocrat. His godfather was the British colonial governor, who grew up unable to speak Sinhala. By this time, however, he had followed a pattern among some other Sinhalese politicians by becoming Buddhist, Sinhala-speaking, and an extremist on language, religion, and Sinhalese culture. His election to the prime ministership in 1956 marked the turning point toward religious and language extremism and ethnic polarization. Despite political slogans about wanting their own language instead of English, there was no own language of the Ceylonese people. There were two main languages representing the two major population groups. From the own language slogan, there was a swift transition to a Sinhala-only slogan, accompanied by attempts to redress ethnic imbalances inherited from the colonial era by giving preferential treatment to the Sinhalese majority. What began as nationalism had become ethnic polarization. It was now a question of the Sinhalese versus the Tamils. Among the first victims of the polarization that began with independence in 1948 were the Indian Tamils, one of the poorest segments of the population, whose only benefit from colonialism was the opportunity to become plantation laborers in Ceylon. With the independence of Ceylon in 1948 came the task of defining citizenship and allocating the political power once held by the British colonial government. Indian Tamils were excluded from citizenship and deprived of the right to vote, which immediately removed 8 Tamil members from Parliament. After negotiations with India, more than 500,000 Indian Tamils were repatriated over the years. Only in the wake of these repatriations did the Ceylon Tamils again become a majority of the resident Tamil population. Discrimination was not limited to the political rights of Indian Tamils. After the government nationalized the port facilities of Colombo, large numbers of Indian Tamil dock workers were replaced by Sinhalese. The number of schools available for the education of the children of Indian Tamils on the plantations declined under the independent government of Sri Lanka from what it had been under the British colonial regime. Tamil demonstrations against the new language policy in 1958 were met by Sinhalese reactions that escalated into widespread and lethal violence. Cars and trains were stopped by Sinhalese mobs and their Tamil occupants killed. Houses were burned down with people inside them. Before the army could restore order, hundreds of people were killed in these interethnic clashes, mostly Tamils. As in other countries and times, chauvinism bred counter-chauvinism. The moderate Ceylon Tamil political party lost virtually all support to more militant political leaders who demanded autonomy in Ceylon Tamil areas and finally a separate state. Nevertheless, preferential treatment for the Sinhalese majority was pushed further. Universities became a political battleground, with university admissions policy being taken out of academic hands and being determined politically at the cabinet level. As of 1969, before the politicization of admissions policy, Tamils constituted 15% of all university admissions, but 40% of all admissions in the sciences, including 48% in engineering and 49% in medicine. In 1972, a new system of grading entrance examinations was introduced, giving different weights according to ethnicity and region. 2 years later, quotas were added. The proportion of Tamil students declined sharply. By 1975, Tamils gained only 14% of the engineering admissions. Similar trends emerged in government employment. Tamils declined from 40% of the clerical service in 1949 to 5% in 1978 to 81. Only 6% of new teachers and less than 5% of police recruits hired were Tamils. In the armed forces, between 1956 and 1970, Tamils declined from 40% to 1%. In the more scientific and technical occupations, however, the Tamils held their own. Growing Sinhalese-Tamil polarization developed around these policies. In the 1977 elections, Tamils gave more than two-thirds of their votes to a party pledged to a separate state. Riots between the two groups also erupted in 1977, leaving an official death toll of 97 Tamils and 24 Sinhalese, along with more than 14,000 people turned into refugees. In 1978, young Tamils formed a militant group called the Liberation Tigers, which claimed credit for 11 killings. Stringent curtailment of civil liberties failed to stop the violence. The 1977 elections in Sri Lanka were the first in which Sinhalese-Tamil issues were not paramount. Sri Lanka's free-spending welfare state, with government ownership extended to more than 90% of all businesses, had produced runaway inflation, 24% unemployment, and the migration of local talent to other countries. The rejection of these policies by the voters brought to power a government which not only restored a greater freedom of private economic activity, reducing inflation and unemployment and greatly increasing the per capita growth in real income, but also a party with a history of somewhat less militant Sinhalese chauvinism and with some significant Tamil voter support. In 1978, this government attempted to ameliorate the language issue by voting the Tamil language some official recognition and making some administrative gestures toward local autonomy. Together with the lack of unanimity among the Tamils on the secession issue, these policies seemed to promise a de-escalation of ethnic polarization. However, the returning prosperity of Indian businessmen under free market conditions, the resentments of their Sinhalese business competitors, and suspicions that this government was not as zealous as previous governments in preserving Sinhalese privileges created a political backlash. Moreover, Tamil extremists saw the need to disrupt efforts at mutual accommodation by terrorist violence, certain to increase polarization. In June and July of 1983, both Sinhalese and Tamils initiated local violence, the Sinhalese against Tamil businesses, in methodically organized looting and arson rather than spontaneous rioting, and Tamils in ambushes of Sinhalese soldiers, provoking new rounds of Sinhalese violence, both by the military and by civilians. These new outbursts of violence between the Sinhalese and the Tamils took hundreds of lives in 1983 and left tens of thousands homeless. The overwhelming majority of the victims were Tamils, and many of the killings were done in gruesome and sadistic fashion, leaving burned and mutilated corpses. However, some Sinhalese individuals have hidden Tamils from mobs at risk to their own lives, but such individual acts of honor and courage showed little sign of prevailing over politicized polarization. Riots, assassinations, and other acts of violence became no longer sporadic but self-sustaining, as revenge and counter-revenge acquired a continuing momentum of their own. As the National Army, overwhelmingly Sinhalese, was sent into the Tamil areas of the north to restore order, in practice it spread the disorder, engaging in indiscriminate killings of Tamil civilians in retaliation for Tamil guerrilla ambushes or fatal landmine explosions. When guerrillas killed 13 soldiers in a 1983 ambush, for example, Sinhalese troops retaliated by pulling 20 Tamils off a bus and killing them. When Sinhalese troops suffered large casualties from landmine explosions, they sometimes massacred whole Tamil settlements, or at least all the young males. Meanwhile, various Tamil guerrilla groups fought among themselves for political supremacy in the north, while a Sinhalese extremist organization took shape in the south and conducted its own terrorism there. In addition to these military and paramilitary clashes, mob violence continued to erupt against the Tamils living in the predominantly Sinhalese south, reaching a climax in the massive riots in the summer of 1983. After Tamil guerrillas bombed an army patrol and then shot the survivors in the northern city of Jaffna, Sinhalese mobs in the capital city of Colombo in the south rioted against the Tamils living there. Deaths ran into the thousands, and the majority of the Tamil population of the city became refugees. The violence then spread out beyond the city, along the coast and up into the highlands. These riots have been considered the point of no return in the escalation of sporadic violence into outright civil war. Thousands of Tamils fled to refugee centers in the south, others fled north to the Tamil areas, and still others fled to India, especially to the Tamil regions of southeastern India. This massive influx of refugees into India, with their stories of widespread atrocities, and with more than 50 million sympathetic fellow Tamils being citizens of India, put pressure on the Indian government to do something. It attempted both to mediate among the factions in Sri Lanka and, in a barely clandestine way, to arm and train Tamil guerrillas on Indian soil. As the Sri Lankan army besieged the city of Jaffna in 1987, Indian planes dropped food and supplies to the Tamils who were holding out. Finally, about 50,000 Indian troops landed in the Tamil regions of Sri Lanka, after an accord forced upon the Sri Lankan government, providing for the Indian troops to substitute for the Sri Lankan troops in maintaining order in the northern Tamil regions and to disarm the guerrillas operating there. Greater autonomy was also promised the Tamils, but well short of independence. This accord was bitterly resented by Sinhalese in general and by Buddhist extremists in particular, leading to new outbreaks of terrorism and assassinations in the south. Within 1 year of the agreement, Sinhalese extremists killed over 200 of those who supported it, and narrowly missed an assassination attempt on the president himself. Meanwhile, Tamil extremists in the north were also opposed to the accord, which stopped short of their demand for independence, and hampered their own drive for political hegemony within the Tamil areas by trying to disarm them. Eventually, renewed guerrilla warfare broke out, this time against the occupying army from India. Again, the fighting was ugly and vicious, with thousands of civilians being killed, some while being used as human shields by the guerrillas or as targets of indiscriminate shooting, bombing, and shelling by the Indian army. All these complex and tragic events unfolded from a relatively simple cause: group polarization, promoted in justification of preferential policies designed to get one man elected Prime Minister of Sri Lanka in 1956. That man, S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike, was neither a racial nor a religious fanatic. He simply seized upon the mood of the moment as a way to get elected Prime Minister, after which he was prepared to negotiate a more reasonable set of policies with the Tamils. But having unleashed fanaticism, he was unable to contain it, and his subsequent attempts at conciliation with the Tamils brought on his own assassination by a Buddhist extremist. There is also reason to believe that the assassination of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991 grew out of India's intervention in Sri Lanka and the bitter disappointments of Sri Lanka's Tamils at the atrocities committed against them by the Indian army, which had initially been welcomed as their saviors. The political attempt to reverse the greater economic successes of the Tamils in Sri Lanka led to a seemingly irreversible escalation of polarization and hostility, in which every segment of the population eventually lost. While the earliest and more severe losses were inflicted upon the Tamils, everyone suffered from the destruction of the country's economy by both war and the loss of tourist revenues due to the war, and by the loss of political freedom as the national emergency was used to justify dictatorial rule that left the same corrupt party in power for more than a decade without an election. Economically, the losses from the conflict over a 6-year period have been estimated as equal to 2/3 of the annual output of the country. The supreme irony is that all this happened in a country once justly held up as a model of harmonious intergroup relations. Moderate Tamil leaders receptive to the government's efforts at compromise and rapprochement have been assassinated by Tamil separatists. There were now those on both sides with a vested interest in conflict as such, for a return to peace and harmony would mean a diminution of their own significance and power.